Hey guys, welcome to the fucking Booty Base. In today's video, I am here with our very own Princess Peach, and I am going to be explaining the differences between a hip thrust and a glute bridge. Now, both of these exercises are phenomenal exercises, and you can definitely use both of them in your training. However, there are definitely some very distinct differences between the two lifts, and lately I've been seeing a few variations pop up which have been confusing the terminology, and me as the glute guru and somebody who prides myself on using correct terminology within my entire lifting and training and teaching and coaching career, it kind of just bugs me a little bit. So in today's video, we're going to be explaining and exploring the differences between hip thrusts, how you can utilize them in your training, and why people should stop confusing the terminology and creating their own exercises to try to make a hybrid of the two. So let's get into the video.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we're going to be explaining a fair few differences between hip thrusts and glute bridges, but I wanted to kick things off with the number one difference and the reason why you call them a hip thrust versus a glute bridge. A hip thrust is any movement pattern where you are thrusting your hips into the air, but your back is elevated up on a box. So Brittany, let's perform a hip thrust. Boom, and down we come. You can perform these in a variety of different ways, which we're going to be exploring and explaining a little bit later. But if you come down to the ground, a glute bridge, terminology-wise, is anything where your back and your shoulders are resting on the ground and you're thrusting up and down like so. So that is tip number one, and that is the number one reason as to why you're going to call things either a hip thrust, elevated on a box, or a glute bridge, shoulders on the ground. Now, the next difference, which is one that is pretty obvious, is the range of motion. You can see Brittany's coming up and down here, and there is a pretty limited range of motion with her glute bridge because she's not elevated on a box and she can't come all the way down. Now, glute bridges like this have been performed for many, many years. You'll see them in aerobics classes, and they've been an exercise that has been around for a very, very long time. However, when we elevate ourselves up on the box, we extend that range of motion. Now, hip thrusts have not been around for anywhere near as long as glute bridges. My very own booty brother and dear friend, Mr. Bret Contreras, invented the hip thrust. I'm not exactly sure how long ago, but they've been popularized over the last 10 years. And the reason why he invented the hip thrust was to be able to get a deeper range of motion within his hip thrust. He experimented and explored a variety of different ways to actually perform them, and eventually came on to just being able to elevate yourself on a box, load a barbell up on your hips so you can come down nice and deep, and then get that extended range of motion to lift more weight off the floor and really get that deep stretch and squeeze on the glutes.
Now, I mentioned earlier that my booty brother Bret Contreras was the inventor of the hip thrust and also the creator of the terminology with hip thrust, and other than myself, probably one of the most well-known coaches to be prescribing both hip thrusts and glute bridges. So I thought, what better opportunity than to invite Bret onto my channel so he could discuss the differences between both hip thrusts and glute bridges, the terminology, and his history with both of the lifts. So, take it away, Bret.
What's the difference between a barbell glute bridge and a barbell hip thrust? So, Aiden was kind enough to invite me onto his channel, knowing that I'm the inventor of the barbell glute bridge and the barbell hip thrust, to explain the differences. So I've been doing both exercises since 2006, both myself and with clients. So yeah, almost 15 years. And early on I did a lot of both. I did a ton of glute bridges and a ton of hip thrusts with my clients. And then along the way we kind of stopped glute bridging. That doesn't mean the glute bridge isn't awesome, it's just the hip thrust is better in my opinion. But some people like the glute bridge more, and they want to know what are the pros and cons of both. Well, the glute bridge is performed from the floor. You don't need a bench. All you need is a bar pad and a barbell with weights, and it's a great movement, people love it. Now the hip thrust, you also need a bench. In my gym, we do them off of hip thrusters or glute benches, and these involve more hip range of motion, more overall barbell displacement, more quad activity. So in terms of overall work being performed, the hip thrust is going to be superior because you move the bar through a greater range of motion. It's the harder lift. Now that doesn't mean it's automatically better, they're just different. In terms of muscle activity, you get similar glute and hamstring activation, but more quad activation with the hip thrust. So the hip thrust is the harder lift, involves more muscles moving through a greater range of motion, whereas the glute bridge is a more targeted movement that better isolates the glutes. For the glutes, you get similar EMG activity in both lifts, but the hip thrust moves the glutes through a little bit more range of motion. Now, which one should you do? Why do you have to choose? Do both. I'm the glute guy, Bret Contreras. I hope you enjoy this snippet.
So there you have it, guys, straight from the inventor of the hip thrust himself. Thank you very much, Bretty boy. But let's keep on continuing into this video so we can take a deeper dive into everything Bret just mentioned and keep on exploring all the differences with more of a fine-tuned detail and a visual representation.
Now, the next difference in comparing a hip thrust to a glute bridge is actually the muscles that are going to be recruited, which aren't necessarily the glutes, and other muscles which might come into play. When we're on a hip thrust, we get a deeper range of motion, but we're also going to be recruiting a little bit more quads as we come down deeper into the rep. Now, some people do feel their quads a lot more on a hip thrust, and there are many other ways we can work around them feeling less quads and more glutes, but it is inevitable that you are going to maybe be working a little bit more quads in a hip thrust regardless of whether you feel it or not. But if Brittany comes down to the ground, you'll see that we're getting far less knee flexion and far less knee bend. So we're really just working the glutes in their end range, and we're able to keep what people call that glute range and be able to just move up and down without as much work from the other contributing muscles into the lift. Now, speaking of this glute range, as mentioned, the glute bridge is keeping the glutes active more so in their glute range as the glutes are coming into peak tension at the top of the lift. Now, again, this limited range of motion is great for the glute bridge and is, I guess, a little bit of an advantage if you don't really want to be utilizing other muscles as compared to our hip thrust. Well, you'll see that as Brittany thrusts all the way up, she's coming up and then all the way down. Now, the argument for a glute bridge over a hip thrust is that when Brittany's knees start to come back from my hand, that she's starting to recruit other muscles and she's dropping out of what we call the glute range. Now, you see, with a hip thrust, at the bottom, you're not really recruiting, well, you are definitely recruiting glutes, but there's nowhere near as much tension at the bottom of the lift as there is as we come up to the top in this shortened position where we are really squeezing. But it again allows you to have that deeper range of motion, so you could potentially be able to lift more weight off the ground in a little bit more of a comfortable fashion. The next difference between a hip thrust and a glute bridge is the loading and, more importantly, the comfortability and enjoyment of the loading across two lifts. You see, we want to be applying as much tension to the glutes as we can, and technically speaking, with a glute bridge, with a shorter range of motion, you would think that you would be able to lift more load, and technically speaking, yes. However, it can be a little bit uncomfortable with a big barbell on your hips, which you can load up really heavy. Now, this weight is very, very fucking light for our very own Princess Peach down here, but imagine if Brittany had 140 kilos on this, which she can quite easily hip thrust. She has to now push that bar away from her as it is coming down towards her face, and that can be a really uncomfortable position for a lot of people if they don't really feel super comfortable in that position. Also, with a glute bridge, it's very often that you see people sliding back as they do their reps, unless they pry themselves up. Brittany, just pretend, this isn't too heavy, but just pump them out. And a lot of the time, girls do this, and I have to get in this really awkward, weird position where I stand like this. Brittany, don't act like you're not enjoying the view. You get in the front row seats, and it keeps them in place, but yeah, this is a little bit of an uncomfortable and awkward situation for a lot of people, unless you're at the booty base. But with a hip thrust, as we come up into the box, wha-boom, as you can see, even though it's a larger range of motion, it's a lot more comfortable for Brittany to be able to hold that weight at the top of the rep, and she doesn't have to worry about it flapping down or rolling onto her neck and killing her while she's doing her reps. Now, for this reason, I like using hip thrusts in a variety of rep ranges, both light, medium, and also really heavy, to be able to get strong, and also using a variety of different techniques. However, for glute bridges, what I normally like prescribing, boom, is actually using them with a dumbbell, because it's a little bit more comfortable, and this is how I like cueing to get in. If you have a pillow or something nice and comfortable, get onto the hips. It's a little bit of an added bonus, but it's not super necessary. You cradle over into the fetal position. Come on over. Boom. Give that dumbbell a cuddle, roll it onto your hips, and then now it's a lot easier for Brittany to be able to hold that dumbbell and push it away from her hips. And I usually like prescribing dumbbell glute bridges, or even if you have like a small barbell or something like that, and I like doing them in higher rep ranges to go for that burn, even adding a knee band, and it's, in my opinion, a better option if you were going to be choosing to put glute bridges into your program. Now, lastly, one more difference between a hip thrust and a glute bridge, and we're starting to get a little bit technical with the terminology here, but it is a slightly different loading pattern and slightly different load vector with both different lifts. Now, another reason why Bret Contreras created the hip thrust was for it to be in a pure anterior posterior or horizontal plane. Now, as you can see, when Brittany's at the top of her hip thrust here, in her peak tension and in her glute range, the weight is going directly down, stay up there for me, Britt, directly up and down through the midline horizontally through her body. So she has to fight really hard to keep that up, but it is a direct up and down force. Now, when we come down into a glute bridge, you'll see that although it is very similar, it's actually a little bit different. Now, Brittany's hips are going in this direction, but the weight is going directly down. So there is a slight difference in the way that the load is going to be challenging your body. And with a glute bridge, you might actually even feel a little bit more upper glutes. But again, they're both great, but they're different. All right. Now we've wrapped up all of the differences. But the thing is, some people don't really seem to understand these differences, and people are confusing the terminology between the glute bridge and a hip thrust. You see, there's been an exercise that's been going around, I've been seeing it promoted here, there, and all the rest, called a CAS glute bridge. Now, this is how you perform a CAS glute bridge. We come all the way up to the top of the rep, and we only are going to be coming down to that glute range. You can probably go a tiny bit lower there, Britt. And as you can see, as soon as Britt's knee starts to leave me, then they're saying that it's not ideal to come all the way down because it's going to start to involve the quads, and it's going to start to do everything else, and to only stay up in this glute range and do a CAS glute bridge. But the thing is, if you remember from tip 1, if your back is elevated on a box, it's not a fucking glute bridge, it's a hip thrust. The CAS glute bridge is not a glute bridge. It's just an end range hip thrust. This has been an exercise that has been around for a very long time, and it's appropriately named because it's a hip thrust in the end range. Now, I'm not saying that an end range hip thrust or a CAS glute bridge is a bad exercise. If anything, I think it's actually a really great exercise. It has a lot of science behind it because, as you can see from all the aforementioned, did I say that right? Fucking hope so. Tips that it will actually help you to keep more tension on the glutes at the end range of motion. So I'm not at all saying that this is a bad exercise to perform. It's just not called a CAS glute bridge, and people shouldn't be naming exercises inappropriately when it's already an exercise. It already has a name. It's just an end range hip thrust. And not only that, but you probably want to be performing full range hip thrust to be able to get the full benefit of also being able to work other areas of your body. But I've had many clients here down in the past who prefer doing constant tension hip thrust. So they come all the way down and they stay closer to that glute range where the bar, here, get the bar on. I want to demonstrate with the bar with this one. Sorry, it's a fucking light, relax. Yeah. It's only 20 kilos. Now, they just only ever do constant tension hip thrust, and they start getting pretty strong with that, but they never actually do reset reps. And when they start wanting to go heavier, and they start wanting to actually get that weight off the ground to hit big PBs, they find it hard because the only rep that they've ever done from the ground is their first rep, and then they're only ever just repeating up and down in the air. So the real question is, if you're not strong enough to get the weight off the ground in that bottom range, then who's to say that you can get that end range actually stronger? So there are a plethora of different reasons as to, a plethora of different other approaches as to how we can target that end range. I'm gonna show you that in a moment. But these girls who had plateaued and couldn't get that weight off the ground comfortably to be able to get the weight up and lock it out, well, I just programmed them to do reset reps come down to the ground, and I told them just only do reset reps for the next 4 weeks, and then their hip thrust strength actually shot up through the roof because they were able to do it more comfortably, come down, reset, refocus, and get that little bit of extra momentum off the ground to really fire those glutes up and actually get that entire range of motion. Also, I've seen other coaches promoting just using the glute drive or other hip thrust machines, which actually start at the top of the rep. Now, even though they're promoting this end range hip thrust, that's great, but for a lot of these people, they're loading it up really heavy on a really stable machine and only doing that end range. Now, that's great, but a lot of people don't have access to those machines. They only have access to barbells. So they need to be able to get the weight off the ground comfortably and get comfortable with doing a full range hip thrust before they can do heavy end range hip thrusts. And not only that, but if you want to go heavy and you want to apply a lot of tension to the glutes, it just feels weird going really heavy and only just doing that end range. Do a couple of, this isn't fucking heavy, but if Brittany had a lot of weight on her hips, she has to like reverse in the air. So yeah, maybe an end range hip thrust is better with lighter weight and higher reps, but if you wanted to get really strong at your hip thrust, well, and add a lot more weight, which is really the number one thing which is going to be growing your glutes, then doing a full range hip thrust is probably for the best. Now, the only reason I say all of this is because people who like to be promoting the CAS glute bridge or the end range hip thrust lately have been kind of speaking against somewhat doing full range hip thrusts. Here's the thing, you should do both. They both have a purpose, and here are a few more other options in how you can actually make them work by still doing hip thrusts elevated on the box and get more peak tension in the glute range without making up a fancy name and making up a new exercise and confusing the terminology. Now, please don't think that I'm bashing end range hip thrust because, again, I do think that they are a fantastic way to be able to make your glutes do more, but they're still hip thrusts if we're elevated on a box. So here are 5 different variations in which you can use to be able to get more out of the glute range on a hip thrust. And the first one is a 1 1/4 hip thrust, where we come all the way up, down a quarter, and we do that additional quarter in the glute range to get more range of motion and also more time on attention with the glutes at the top. The second is very similar, where we do a triple pulse. So very, very similar, but just adding more pulses. And both of these variations really, really, really burn. The next one is going to be a 3-second ISO hold, or 3 to 5 seconds, where we just hold at the top. And these are fantastic for really building that lockout strength and really recruiting, go one more, Brandon, really recruiting a lot of muscle, a lot of motor units at the top. And these are a fantastic variation for beginners to use to really start getting that mind-muscle connection in their glutes. Now, the next one would be kind of similar to the CAS glute bridge and range hip thrust, which is just a constant tension hip thrust, where we don't actually touch back down to the ground. We perform our reps in a higher fashion, it's a higher rep fashion, generally using lighter loads, and we just smash it out like so. And lastly, what we can do is actually elevate ourselves onto blocks, so we actually are lifting with less range of motion. However, we can do it with a little bit more comfortability because we can come down, reset, jack ourselves up to move that heavy weight up off the ground, but we're gonna be able to roll under the bar a lot easier and only do it closer to that actual glute range at the top of the rep. Well, now that we've got that out of the way, let's just quickly go over one more time what the differences are, nice and quick, between hip thrusts and glute bridges, and a few other variations which might be a little confusing as well. This is a hip thrust, and this is a glute bridge. This is a single leg hip thrust. This is a single leg foot elevated glute bridge. This is a frog thrust. This is a frog pump. And this is a foot elevated frog pump. This is a single leg double elevated hip thrust. And this is not just some made up variation of the glute bridge. This is just an end range hip thrust. Well, Brittany, that was beautiful. Thanks. Now guys, in closing, I just wanted to let you know that I don't actually think that this end range glute bridge, or actually is just a partial range hip thrust, is a bad exercise. I think it's awesome, and I think that coaches out there who are explaining the terminology and tension and differences on muscles worked is actually a good thing. But I wanted to make this video because I'm the glute guru. I care about terminology. And terminology doesn't change just because the hip thrust is performed in an end range. So, coaches out there, trainers, trainees, please use the right words when you are conducting your coaching, creating your content, and let's make this world a more beautiful place for everybody to live. Now, guys, if you don't already know, by this time of the video, if you've stuck around this goddamn long, I'm gonna need you to do me a favor. I'm gonna need you to like, comment, subscribe, turn on the motherfucking bell, and ladies and gentlemen, Princess Peach. You know what they say, YouTube